before this gets into too much of a catfight, what I thought I'd do is to set the ground rules by basically suggesting 4 areas that we should focus on sequentially. So I'll, try and steer the conversation in that direction. The first one is the issue of should the government have the right, remember we're talking about television audience, so should the government have the right to intervene to acquire land by force? If so, under what circumstances? Now, there's obviously a lot of law behind this, but just your view is to introduce the subject. That's the first issue. Then, assuming we all agree that public purpose is one such basis on which the government can step in, I'd like for us to discuss and debate what is the meaning and scope of public purpose. And I'll try and steer that conversation. A third point is to do with whether the public purpose can be served by a for-profit company. I think that's an interesting subject for our audience to hear. And then finally, if we have time, then I might want to raise a certain set of issues with respect to challenges of implementation. Let me start with you, Nitin. So you have the most academic of backgrounds around this table, and ask you the question: does government have the right, under any circumstances, to step in and acquire land forcibly?
I think the right of eminent domain exists in any common law country, and it's not something that you can take away. It would exist even in a village. You go to a village requires land for a temple. Mostly there is enough common land for this purpose in a village. But in the rare instances where this would not be the case, the villagers will, by moral suasion, get hold of the land they require for that purpose, but it's a public purpose. So I don't think the problem is government acquiring land compulsorily. It's the purpose for which they acquire that needs to be justified in each case. And that's really where the rub of the argument has to be.
Okay, but Ajay, let me ask you the question. I can think of a circumstance in which the purpose need not be a public purpose, where what is called the holdout phenomenon, where you have, let's say, an entrepreneur that is building a manufacturing facility, has aggregated, I don't know, 80, 85%, 95% of the land, but there are a couple of landholders that refuse to give up their piece of land and create problems of contiguity, that you don't have contiguous possession, and therefore a project that is perfectly, valid is unable to be executed. Under those circumstances, should the government have the right to take care of the residual? Well, first step enforceably.
First of all, in India, the right to property was by constitution a fundamental right. Somewhere during the emergency, Mrs. Gandhi tried to modify that and remove it from the fundamental rights. That Lok Sabha, which was considered illegal, didn't actually pass it. But the new government, Janata government that came in 1978, actually removed this right from the constitution. It is still under challenge in the Supreme Court in order to find out what exactly. So I think, first of all, when you talk of a free country, you have a right to property is a very important fundamental right and must be restored. And if you really test it on the anvil of absolution and take a sharp definition, government actually can take away 1 crore of rupees of yours and replace it with 10,000 rupees and would have a right to do that. So under these circumstances, the issue of eminent domain, etc. becomes a semantic discussion. However, I think governments, local as well as state as well as central government, must have right of eminent domain when it is for a public purpose.
Let me turn to you, Arun, and quote to you a part of the draft of the bill, which would suggest that acquisition of land for a person, which includes any company, is perfectly acceptable if the person requires land for a purpose which is quote unquote useful to the public and has already lawfully acquired up to a minimum of 70% of the total land required for the project. Now that seems to be much more relaxed criterion for government stepping in than these two gentlemen are suggesting. Do you agree with this?
I think it's a fair way to do it. I think Dr. Desai started off well. Now, the word public purpose has actually been debated, and in Supreme Court decisions it said that creating employment itself is public purpose. Now, you can get into a debate as to whether it is for a corporate good or for a general good. But if you step back a little and look at the demographics of this country, 50% of the population is still below the age of 25. They need to find employment. So we will have to industrialize. Globally, we are one of the very few, if not the only country, which has got a growing working population, whereas the rest of the world has got a higher aging population. So as the world is going to consume more and demand more services, it will have to be produced somewhere. I was partly instrumental in what's been doing, because as you know, we were the first ones to set SEZ. The issue came up at one stage was that government should not get involved in buying land for the private enterprise. Rajiv, the problem is that the moment Abhijit Guha declares that he is going to a particular place to set up a human pie factory or whatever it is, the farmers, if you give them three things, the farmer needs a fair compensation. I think most important, he needs employability of his children. That's what he looks at it. And third, that you handle him in not by force. You have to. And I saw that in Jaipur. We acquired 3,000 acres of land at the same time Nandigram was going.
Did the government acquire or
you bought? We bought with the government.
That's different. Because
we got it.
I thought we were discussing government acquisition.
It was done by the government. It was a negotiated deal, but done with the government. The problem, Rajiv, is that aggregators are normally people who are trying to make quick money. They have no stake, nothing at stake except to make money. And you need this sort of legislation to take care of that sort of situation. I gave you a long-winded answer to say that you always have 10, 15, 20, 30% of land with the aggregators. I'm being polite to call them aggregators, some people call them.
So you think it is justified?
It's justified.
Okay.
But if employment is justified as the paper that came as a background paper said, then if a company is going down or if the company is sacking people, should it be nationalized to keep things?
No, Ajit, you know better than me that under section 63, if you have acquired land from the government and you want to do change of users in the land, has to go back to the farmer.
I'm talking if the principle of employment is considered as a public purpose, then any company that's sacking people should be nationalized for public purpose.
It's happening in America, no? City land got nationalized.
Do you want to give that land to the government?
Yeah. I'm setting up a factory. I require 1,000 people to work in that factory of a particular skill, and the 1,000 people are available. 990 agree to work for me, but 10 refuse. And unless those 10 work for me, I can't run that factory. Am I allowed to go to the government and say, conscript these 10 and force them to work for me?
You can, Dr. Desai, get 10 other people, train them and put them in the job. But if you got a 1,000-acre plot and 5 acres in between interspersed is not given, you can't run your factory. You need to get your material and men to move through that process. So I think that example is slightly different.
Clearly there are 2 points of view here. There's one that is the purest view about on the narrow circumstances in which eminent domain is justified, and then there is a slightly more relaxed definition of the same. Jerry, I wanted to ask you a question. I know that you are interested in low-cost housing. Land aggregation is a big problem in this country because of the uneven nature, shall we say, and the uneven quality of our land records. Right? In economist parlance, this would be characterized as a market failure. Do you think the lack or the poor quality of land records is the justifiable enough reason for the government to aggregate land on your behalf so that you can build low-cost housing.
I think these are all the kinds of arguments that crony capitalists use to justify getting the government to help them do their job. And this land record business, because I can't buy with clear title, once they acquire the title is clear. This is in my opinion, a complete red herring. The solution to that is to get our title fixed. The solution to that is to publish our, electronically, digitally, whatever, the taluka records as they exist, and give people 2 years, saying 20 years ago my family partition is not recorded, whatever. Give them a fair amount of time, and after that, the titles are frozen. Or to encourage companies to do title insurance. They can make money doing it. There's many ways. This using the blunt, coercive instrument of a tyrannical state to beat up people to say you have to give up 30% because I've taken 70%. That too in conjunction.
Clearly, you thought that process integrity is much more important than the other.
Otherwise, that's the end of civilization.
This government, for example, has consistently turned to the argument of private participation in infrastructure. Not explicitly, but implicitly on the ground, the government is incapable of providing.
No, I'm sorry. I don't think that's the objective because it's incapable of providing. There are a variety of reasons for public-private participation. One is managing the engine of growth to a public asset. Second is to more efficiently manage an asset that is given, so that you don't create a large body of government service. There are a variety of reasons. When you are talking of a road which serves a public purpose, whether then it is done on a public-private partnership basis or whether it is 100% built by the state, it hardly matters. But you can't allow me to build my automobile factory on a land that is acquired from somebody else.
The principal beneficiaries are the shareholders of that company.
Yeah.
Incidentally, to say I've created a few jobs and therefore the country benefits or the public benefits. This is a complete wild goose.
We need to move on to the next subject.
Moving on to address the curmudgeon problem, which we cannot ignore. What I have suggested is the possibility of creating a legal basis for a negotiation there akin to what we have for collective bargaining and not relying on the Land Acquisition Act. Creating a structure and a framework by which you as a buyer can negotiate with the community, and it's then the community which becomes a party, exactly as in a trade union. When you negotiate with the trade union, if 80% of the members agree, the other 20% cannot hold up against the 80%, not against you. You see? Because that is a difference.
But
you're not using it under eminent domain. You're using the power of the community rather than the power of the government.
Is there a juridical basis that
No, because unfortunately we do not. See, in the case of labor relations, we have a law of collective bargaining, and the role of the government there is not to force anybody to do this or that. And exactly in the same situation in land, I say yes, by all means have something akin to that, so you don't have the curmudgeon problem necessarily.
In the United States, there has been actually a trend towards making the definition of public purpose narrower, right? And
No. It was the courts that made it broader.
Yeah, but there's been a reaction to that.
I hope so.
There's been a reaction to that. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves here, what I want to again put up for debate is, does economic development more broadly defined constitute a public purpose? Now let me just give you an example to set the context. The state of Uttar Pradesh wants to aggregate land for an industrial zone, right? For that, and eventually that zone will be occupied by, private companies. But the state is creating what we might call economies of agglomeration. to create infrastructure. It's a Chinese version. The government is creating an SEZ, okay, to attract in a contiguous area where high quality infrastructure is provided, investment from industry. Would that be public purpose?
So first, let's stop the comparison with China. China is not a free country. There is no rule of law. So it stops. I think all we need to borrow from China is the purposefulness with which their government acts.
Right.
Nothing else.
So they act in the public.
That's okay. That's all right. But it's not a free country. So we are discussing situations of a free country, which is very different.
Right.
Now, when we come to this, when you look at the land needed for public purpose, and I mean purely public purpose, I think some structural reforms are called for in this country. We do not manage our cities. We do not manage our own towns. If we create town, city and village management structure, the third tier of government, and work out a proper laid down process of expanding the city or town limits by adding land from it, by a process that exists in the United States everywhere. Whenever that much extra land is added, there are public hearings to be created. That land is then demarcated as added to the city. When you do all these things, then you bring the land in the city. The public use in the city is far more easy to handle in terms of the municipality giving the land for an airport, giving the land for a park, giving the land for a water treatment plant or a solid waste disposal plant, so that it can create a partnership. Because when you take an exhibition, the take from the exhibition is just 1/10 of the total take the city makes.
Right.
So it makes sense for the city to invest in that. So when you look at public purpose, I think it should stay public purpose. So by some structural reform, you could remove a lot of land that will come under urbanization, which will be part of a city and can be contributed to the city. And then the city itself can sell off that land to private enterprise to set up their factories. Nobody bought the land and gave it to you free in Bombay.
Go back to Pune in the 60s, right? Today, MIDC is not doing it. This is private, Bharat Forge is setting us, that we are setting an economic zone. If Pune did not have the MIDC areas in Pilpage and Shore, or if Thana did not have that area, or if Nasik did not have Satpur, where would these lakhs of kids found jobs? Is that a public purpose or is that not a public?
But the acquisition of that land posed very few problems. The fact is that today the incentive, in those days, and the incentive for the people who sell land for that purpose is sufficiently significant. I do not see a huge problem in aggregating land for industrial purposes.
It's a question of concentration. It's
Not even for industrial estate. It is not a big ticket item.
I think if you reclassify the agricultural land to industrial land, price discovery would happen in 24 hours, people would get decent compensation, and in the private market, these transactions will be settled.
Reverting to the old issues, let me start. No, to develop Arun's point, let me ask, just give me an opportunity to do this. Acquiring land for the ultra mega power project, which is then handed over to the competitive winner in a bid process that is making profit, right? Is that not a public purpose?
The public purpose would be, let us say that this electricity will be provided to the public, and therefore we need a. But when electricity becomes a private enterprise, entire property of the private enterprise. Now, for example, in a road, the road property which government acquires is not sold to the buyer. The person who builds it on build, operate and transfer at the end of the concession is reversed back to the people. When you have a project which is constantly owned, is owned by somebody, then if you're going to give it for power, why not for cars? Why not for dogs? Why not dogs?
Let me push that.
For dogs bars.
No, I understand.
I want an acquisition.
Right.
So that's a public purpose.
That's a public purpose. But it's
public purpose.
Let me just.
Suppose I have a large plot of land myself.
Yes.
Somebody comes to me and says, I want to set up a shop in the corner of your plot of land. Right? what are the circumstances under which I would treat the setting up of that shop of being of sufficient benefit to me so that I've given the land at concessional or free price. That is the test that I would apply. When will somebody outside the boundary of this entity gain? Public purpose is a very vague word, as you know. The law courts have given very generous interpretations. Right. Let's talk of public use, a phrase also used in the Act. Yes. Let's talk of public good.
Let me push you on that. What public good does it do to give land for building bungalows for politicians to occupy?
Let's go back. Let's go back to the example of the power plant, right? Okay. Now, what is the difference? What is the difference if the power plant was set up by NTPC as opposed to some private company?
No difference.
What would be the difference?
No difference. No difference.
Both would qualify for public purpose?
No.
I'm asking the question. Both qualify for public purpose.
Rajiv, if there are any mistakes made by an individual in power, you cannot say the system is wrong. Because under the law, there is a process by which the government has to apply its mind to find whether it is for public good or not. Because you cannot just, I cannot go and tell the industries department to give me the land. It has to go through a process. You have to go to the industry.
Are you in favor of property being restored, the fundamental right? It is a fundamental right to a free society.
It's fascinating that you brought that up.
Yes.
At that time, we were told that this fundamental right to property is being only supported by the big Tatas and the Birlas and not by the people. 50 years later, the beneficiary of kind of taking it away from the farmers was who? Yeah. You know, in Singapore. I mean, you know, actually, it has hurt the poor. So getting rid of property as a fundamental right has not hurt the rich. The rich have been able to fix it and get their SEZs. Get it acquired. In fact, they used the law to fix what they wanted. It's a poor have been hurt.
And you know, rickshaws are being confiscated by Delhi Municipal Corporation and destroyed. This is a right to property. It's not a property for them. So these are things that we need to please understand, that we do want to have fundamental right to property, and that this can be taken away by force from you only and only for a public purpose.